Africa critically needs to realize development and get itself out of poverty. But the big question is, how do we go about it? Through aid or aid for trade? Today on Street Talk, we'll be talking to the coordinator of Aid for Trade, World Trade Organization, Michael Roberts, who is going to give us an in-depth understanding of aid for trade and how it can help in kickstarting ailing economies. Stay with us on the program. Michael Roberts, thank you for being a guest on my program.
My pleasure.
What is the difference between aid and aid for trade?
One is an essential part of the other. If you look at aid encompasses assistance to the social sector, to things like education, health, debt relief. What aid for trade looks at the elements that have an impact on the trade performance of a country. So aid for trade is one of a number of different instruments which will have an impact on a country's trade performance. If you think of the other aspects, you've got obviously the mobilization of domestic resources, savings in the economy, foreign direct investment, loans from the international community. What aid for trade is about the concessional aspects of aid which go towards assisting trade performance.
Looking at your two-day program, this morning you shared a discussion on developing a roadmap for the implementation of the proposed framework for aid for trade in Central African regional economic communities. What did the delegates arrive at?
I think an understanding that those processes are already ongoing on the ground. We're not starting from zero. We're not reinventing the wheel. If you look at ECAS, CIMAC, the regional integration organizations in Central Africa, they already have plans for development sector at a sectoral level, at the level of the community, and also some very important trade agreements that they already have in place. So the focus was very much on how do we get those agreements implemented and working for the benefit of the governments and the private sector and ultimately of the citizens in those countries, with a view to promoting economic growth, development and poverty alleviation.
How successful has that been so far?
Well, look, this is the start of a process. It's not the end point. Excuse me. So what we were doing today was really sketching out the process that will follow. One thing to mention, I think, also is that, as I said, this is not a new process. It's building on top of already existing processes. So those will carry on into the future. What we're trying to do is trying to get the international communities to sit up and pay attention to the needs, to redouble the efforts of the countries themselves, to be looking at implementing those plans for regional economic integration.
During your two-day discussion, we got to realize that the private sector was not invited to partake in the conversations. Why not?
At this stage, look, the idea is to engage the private sector. There cannot be economic development without the private sector involved. If you're looking at trade, it's not governments that trade in natural resources, it's the private sector or natural resources, whatever product or service you're talking about. The final beneficiary of aid for trade has to be the private sector. So within this optic of the roadmap that we're agreeing, a large portion of the actions that will be identified will be precisely those that favour the private sector in terms of looking at improving the business climate, looking at trying to improve the possibilities for the private sector to take advantages of the opportunities that are out there with things like the Africa Growth Opportunity Act, with the Everything But Arms initiative, etc. At this stage, though, what we need is the government's agreement to participate in this process. We need their stamp of approval to say, go ahead and do it. So that's what we have at the end of this process. We have an agreement on a roadmap, and that roadmap will include dialogue with the private sector.
You're the coordinator of Aid for Trade, the World Trade Organization. When we talk about Aid for Trade, where are we going to get funds from?
For aid for trade, you were talking about, as I mentioned at the start, the idea is it's part of the global package of official development assistance. Now, the official development assistance, we're talking a figure of around $110, $120 billion every year.
Where is it coming from?
That's coming from the donors, from the development partners.
Who are they?
Those there, you're talking about the
World
European
Bank?
Union, members of the OECD, the OECD countries. European Union, the United States, Japan, Australia, but also increasingly and encouragingly, you're also seeing, and if you look at the WTO, our members are not just those members, we also have China, India, Brazil, the emerging economies, if you want to put it in simple language, that are also becoming important commercial partners for this part of the world. And also increasingly important development partners as well. One need only think about the increasing role of China in the region. So the agenda is not just limited to traditional sources of financing, but also looks at the role that South-South partners can play as well.
Would it be right to say that part of the funds will come from the European Development Fund?
Absolutely.
Which that is, it's a regurgitation of the existing funds of the European Development Fund, which is going to entice the ACP countries into signing the Economic Partnership Agreement.
Look, I'm not here to defend or ongoing negotiations between WTO members. So the European Union is one member of the WTO. Members of the members of the WTO that come from Central Africa are another group of members. Our business is not about bilateral relations. Our business is multilateral rules. Okay, so what we're interested in is the application of those rules and to ensure that members of the WTO get the maximum benefit from those rules. That's what this agenda is about. This is an old criticism of the Aid for Trade agenda. It's old wine in new bottles. I think the issue here is to say that there was a deliberate choice that was made in 2005 to be looking at the mechanisms for aid for trade in terms of additional, predictable, sustainable and effective funding. Now, if we were looking to create new mechanisms, the danger is that, of course, you spend many years talking about the creation of those mechanisms, the membership of those mechanisms, the funding of those mechanisms, etc. So there was a deliberate choice that was made instead to go down the route of using existing mechanisms and to make sure that they are acting in the best way possible. So more and better being the slogan that we've been looking to try and promote with both our development partners and with the partner countries.
We are counting on these donor countries to be able to sponsor, trade in Central Africa and the regional economic communities. Recently, the funds directed towards Africa has decreased, coming from the donor countries.
Look, I'm not in a position to comment on the activities of any one member. For a very good reason, which is that I'm perhaps not the best person to be actually talking about this. I'm not in charge of the European Union's development funding, although I would say that if you look at the figures that are reported to that we have reported to us, the figures for aid for trade to Africa have been on a steady increase. Now, our question is that trend likely to continue in the future? And what is the impact of those funds on the ground? So that's very much the angle that we're looking to pursue with this agenda. You can see that for Central Africa as a whole, if you look at the figures that we have, there's a lot of variation in the figures, not just at a regional level from one year to the next, but also between countries in terms of what they receive. So part of this process is a transparency process, looking at not just what the European Union provides, but what the United States provides, what Japan provides, what Australia provides, what the emerging donors also provide, making sure that that assistance is in response to the needs, making sure that those needs are properly expressed, and making sure that the aid for trade agenda is an effective agenda which results in trade growth, economic growth, and poverty alleviation.
You know, during your 2-day stay, we had Muna Muputola, who is the manager of Regional Integration Trade Division of the African Development Bank. How involved is the African Development Bank in this entire process?
I think it's integral to the process. It's Africa's development bank. And Africa looks to its development bank to resolve its challenges. So as one of our partners in this process, the African Development Bank plays an absolutely key role in this process.
Okay. How do you intend to move from, making trade possible to making it happen in the continent?
Well, I mean, that's exactly what the Aid for Trade agenda is about, because if you look at the possible side of it, that's about the trade rules. That's about the trade negotiations. That's what AGOA is about. That's what Everything But Arms is about. That's what similar initiatives are about. You make trade possible. Doesn't mean to say it happens, though. And that's exactly what this agenda is about, in terms of saying you face a number of supply-side constraints, infrastructure constraints that need to be overcome to make those trade opportunities actually happen.
Director General Pascal Lamy, during an opening session of the second Global Review of Aid for Trade on July 6, 2009, said, if aid for trade was urgent in 2007, then it is essential today. It is investment that will allow many developing countries prepare to exit the crisis by, enhancing trade capacity. But there is this fear that aid for trade will reduce resources that are directed to other development projects like, environment, health, education. Is there any reason to fear?
Look, I mean, it's a concern. I won't say that it's not. It's something which is obviously tracked in terms of if looking at the transparency that the mechanism tries to provide. That's one of the issues which has arisen, and that's the reason for the. If you go back to the recommendations that were made back in 2006, it's one of the reasons why we said aid for trade should be additional. We shouldn't be taking money away from those other sectors. And indeed, if you're looking at, if you just take the education sector, okay, the linkages may not be exact, but if you want to grow your service sector, then you have to have literate workers in the service sector. You have to have that basic and advanced education. So all these things, they also have an impact on the operation of the economy and the efficiency of the economy.
Africa has received about $500 billion in aid for the last 50 years, but despite these huge inflows into the continent, aid assistance has not demonstrated results. How different will aid for trade be?
Then I think what you have to do is you have to look at the partnership which underpins this process. And as members of the media holding us to account on this, the agenda that we need to pursue on aid for trade, now in part motivated by budgetary constraints that we face and the reduction in overall public spending amongst the countries that are providing aid, part of that, and more generally, I think also for reasons of accountability, not just in donor countries, but also in recipient countries, is we need to show that this agenda works. And that the promise of aid for trade lives up to its promise. Now, you can see we already have some ideas of where this is working in other regions in the world. If you look at Cambodia, Vietnam, Laos, and you look at the investment that has been made there, in part by the Asian Development Bank, by Japan, by other traditional donors, and you look at the economic growth in those countries, you can see that aid is playing a part. It's playing a part in tandem with other actions, liberalization of the economy, improving the business environment, investment, foreign direct investment, etc. Now, it's playing its part there. The question is, within an African context, showing that that process is working as well. Importantly here, going back to this point about the coming out of economic crisis, you can see that the African countries have come out rather quickly. If you look at rates of growth in African countries this year, a lot of them are you can see that they've rebounded very quickly back to the levels of 2008. And you have some new factors here which are very encouraging in terms of new poles of growth. I talked about the emerging economies, India, China, Brazil, etc. These new poles of growth, which mean that, and also the reforms which have been undertaken by African governments, mean that the domestic environment is changing, and hopefully the aid which is going to be provided as part of the Aid for Trade agenda should be effective.
You know, I believe that, you know, the broad idea is to put Africa on the global economic map and undermine the popular cliché that Africa is a continent without hope. Don't you think that unless trading relationship between the North and the South is significantly improves, maybe all the benefits of official and debt relief may be worth little?
Look, well, let me go back to the point that I was just making. It's not just the trading relationship between the North and the South. If you look at the new poles of growth in the global economy, they offer opportunities for growth for African exporters. And I don't subscribe to this idea of a continent of despair. I just simply don't subscribe to that view. I think that, and certainly if you look at our discussions over the last 2 days, that's certainly not the view which has come out. Instead, what I see is a new agenda of responsibility coming along. One of the issues that was very much coming out of the last 2 days was to say, right, we've signed these agreements. Now, how do we implement them? How do we hold ourselves to account? Before we're even asking anything of anybody else, how do we hold ourselves to account in terms of the actions that we need to take? So that agenda of accountability, that agenda of economic growth and possibility now, I think, is infusing the African continent, and you need only see what's going on in South Africa to get that feeling of hope about what's happening.
Is there any fear that, you know, if Africa attains a desired level of development, there may be a threat to the developed nations? I'm
not the best place to answer that. I think certainly if you look at the WTO's perspective on our membership, each and every member has the same weight in the organisation. Certainly within the WTO, we don't see any second-class membership. We only see one category, that's our members and our membership. They may be distinguished in terms of levels of development, but in terms of the operation of the organisation, it's very clear we don't make any distinction. All members are equal.
So would you agree that, or disagree that official aid is increasingly being used to drive, you know, the African countries towards liberalisation?
No, I don't agree with that view. But there is a point which is perhaps underlying that concern, which is that there are costs related to trade liberalisation, which the development community can assist with. So trade-related adjustment is one of the issues that we treat under the Aid for Trade agenda. And indeed, it was one of the issues that came up in the last 2 days, but more in the context of the implementations of agreements that have been signed within the region rather than internationally.
Thank you very much, Michael Roberts. When we come back in a very short while, we are going to talk about aid for trade being extremely necessary for Africa or not being very useful.
My pleasure.
During the two-day workshop that was organized on the proposed framework for aid for trade in Central Africa and regional economic communities, recommendations were arrived at on how to facilitate trade in the continent and north to south trade. We are going to have a report on what was totally discussed during the meeting. Africa needs to be dragged out of poverty and get set on the road to prosperity and self-sufficiency. In order for this beautiful dream to come true, regional economic communities in Africa will need to make trade a priority. That is why African communities need to embrace Aid for Trade initiative, which was launched in 2005, born to make trade not only possible, but make it happen.
Aid for trade is the investment that will allow many developing countries prepare to exit the crisis by enhancing their trade capacity. The crisis has a human face, and the impact on demand is severe. Poverty alleviation targets, whether as Millennium Development Goals or otherwise, have become more challenging to achieve. That is one of the reasons why there is a wide recognition of the need for the private sector to get organized at regional levels for effective public-private collaboration. By pooling available resources and expertise, regions can achieve economies of scale. Small and least developed countries may not have the resources to establish strong trade institutions for their own key export sectors, but by getting together with their neighbors, they can make real progress. In developing circles, trade is becoming accepted as a way to address poverty. There is a growing attention paid to aid for trade. If the direction of the crisis is not reversed, real progress will not be made by developing countries. Banks have not set an aid for trade target, but industrialized nations have pledged billions of dollars in aid for trade by 2010 to help developing countries become more competitive and leverage the world economy. The World Bank is also increasing its aid for trade activities as a way of promoting sustainable and inclusive development.
Welcome back to my one-on-one with Michael Roberts, who is the coordinator of Aid for Trade, World Trade Organization. Do you think that it is aid, not trade, that is the answer for Africa's development?
No, absolutely not. No, I think trade is the answer. Trade is one of the answers, let's put it that way. Aid is an end to trade. It's not. Aid for trade is not the end point. It's aid to trade. So aid so that Africa can improve its trade performance, and from that will flow economic growth, poverty reduction.
A bestseller book by a Zambian economist, I'm sure you've heard about her, Dambisa Moyo, titled Dead Aid, argues that Western assistance has given rights to the dependency culture in developing countries and it's constrained by some conditionalities. What is your take on this?
My take is the last chapter of her book, which looks at the solution, which is trade. Her book talks about Africa standing on its own 2 feet on the basis of trade relations with the rest of the world.
That Africa should be a partner.
Exactly, as a trading partner of the rest of the world. And I think that's fundamentally what this agenda is about, in terms of trying to put in place the conditions that, as you said, make not just trade possible, but make it happen. That's really what this agenda is about.
If Africans have to trade with themselves, trade will develop instead of trading with the Western countries, instead of establishing a North-South relationship.
Look, I mean, as I said, North-South is one of the relationships. There's also East-West, South-South. And so I think one of the points that's always been clear here is that a weakness that a lot of the countries have is a dependence on a limited number of markets and a limited number of products. One step towards diversification is to be looking at new markets, and new market opportunities are presenting themselves, and then to be looking at diversification of products as well. So it's not just about North-South, it's about South-South, and it's also about regional integration processes. And that's exactly what we've been discussing the last 2 days, is how do you actually go about supporting those regional integration processes and taking the national actions which are necessary to make good on the promises that have been made in the legal documents that have been signed.
With Aid for Trade, emphasis is laid on infrastructure. Don't you think that there is a bigger fish to fry when we talk about, the custom duties, the business climate, and the poor capacity of the private sector?
No, I mean, you've hit the nail on the head. It's not just about infrastructure. It's about a coherent approach which looks at from the field to the port, from the field to the supermarket shelf, if you like. So you're looking at the productive response that's necessary to try and help the farmer to be able to produce. You're looking at that produce that goes on the truck, which is going to go to market, which is then going to have to pass through a number of obstacles, should we say, on its way. It's going to get to the port, and then it's going to be sold into the global market. It's looking at a whole value chain approach, the actions that are necessary right the way through that chain, and in terms of the larger economy, the business climate, and the other points that you made. It's exactly about that.
You know, I just have one last question for you. The U.S. Treasury Secretary Paul O'Neill some time ago in Ghana said, you know, the U.S. package will be directed only to countries who show good governance and also who encourage economic freedom. This means they must show that they are opening their markets, you know, reducing subsidies and, you know, privatizing industries. The paradox, however, is that the U.S. and the EU, the world's two largest trading blocs, are not implementing at home free trade policies that they insist that African countries should take. Let me give you an example. This was seen when the U.S. had announced its new farm bill, which will increase U.S. farm subsidies by $35 billion. How do you respond to this?
Look, I think let me respond by putting this in the context of what the WTO is doing at the current time. You have the Doha Development Agenda. The idea is to have a trade liberalization agenda which covers a multitude of different areas, which will bring benefits for all 153 members of the WTO. In addition, you also have the Aid for Trade agenda, which means that if you're talking about the trade rules which allow trade to happen, then we're making sure through the Aid for Trade agenda, which make it possible, rather we're making sure through the Aid for Trade agenda that it does happen. That's our response to the question. I don't want to focus in on what one particular member may be saying or your views about one particular member. Let's look at the bigger picture. From the WTO's perspective, what we're doing is trying to make the trade opportunities, put the trade opportunities there through the liberalization agenda and trying to make it happen through Aid for Trade.
Thank you for being my guest on the program.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
We thank you all for being a part of the program, and we hope that the efforts that the donor countries and Africa itself in making towards developing trade will come to its completion. Have a wonderful evening in the company of our programs. Goodbye.